Homeless Maid bumped into a Millionaire luxury car, never expected he'd fall for her instantly. Sophia Hart pedaled her worn bicycle down the bustling streets of New York City, her chestnut hair tied back into a loose ponytail that struggled to stay in place against the biting autumn wind. The morning was crisp, with golden leaves carpeting the sidewalks, but the beauty of the city went unnoticed. Sophia's thoughts were consumed by a mental checklist of the day ahead: pick up art supplies, deliver her mother's medication, and clock in for her afternoon shift at the cafe. Her life had been a blur of responsibilities for as long as she could remember. At 24, she had long abandoned any illusions of the carefree existence her peers seemed to enjoy. Her mother's fragile health and the ever-present threat of mounting bills had a way of anchoring her to reality. The streets were alive with honking horns and the chatter of pedestrians. Sophia swerved to avoid a parked delivery truck, clutching the handlebars tightly. In the basket attached to her bike, a canvas bag bulged with sketchbooks and paints, her last splurge after weeks of saving tips from the cafe. The moment happened in an instant. As Sophia turned onto Fifth Avenue, her gaze flickered toward the time on a nearby clock tower. Panic set in. She was running late. Her grip tightened on the handlebars, her legs pumping harder. It was then that she caught sight of a sleek black Aston Martin Vantage parked just ahead, its gleaming surface reflecting the morning light. She didn't see the open car door until it was too late. The edge of the door clipped her handlebars, sending her bicycle skidding to the side. Sophia tumbled onto the pavement, her bag of art supplies spilling onto the asphalt. A sharp pain shot through her elbow, but her focus immediately shifted to the unmistakable scratch her bike had left on the car's glossy finish. "Oh no, no, no," she muttered, scrambling to her feet. Her heart raced as she assessed the damage, a long, jagged line etched into the pristine paint. A voice, calm but firm, broke through the chaos. "Are you hurt?" Sophia turned, her breath catching as she looked up. The man who had stepped out of the car was strikingly handsome, his tailored navy suit fitting him with precision. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his piercing blue eyes regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. I'm fine," Sophia stammered, brushing gravel from her jeans. "I'm so sorry about your car. I wasn't paying attention." The man's gaze shifted to the scratch, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, she thought he might explode with anger, but instead, he surprised her. "It's just a car," he said with a shrug. "Are you sure you're okay?" Sophia blinked, her brain struggling to process his response. "Yes, I'm fine. But your car, we'll figure that out later," he interrupted, his tone disarmingly calm. "Do you need help?" "No." Sophia glanced at the spilled contents of her bag, panic setting in again. She dropped to her knees, frantically gathering her sketchbooks and paints. The man crouched beside her, picking up a tube of paint and inspecting it. "Crimson red," he remarked, handing it to her. "Nice choice." Sophia stared at him, unsure whether he was mocking her or genuinely curious. "Thanks," she said cautiously, stuffing the paint into her bag. Once her belongings were gathered, Sophia stood and adjusted her bag over her shoulder. The man rose with her, his imposing height making her feel small, but not intimidated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. "I'm Ethan Grayson," he said, handing her the card. "If there's anything I can do to help, or if you want to talk about the car, call me." Sophia hesitated before taking the card. The name sounded vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it. She glanced at the embossed lettering, Grayson Enterprises. It didn't mean much to her, but the card itself felt expensive, the kind of thing belonging to someone who didn't usually stop to talk to people like her. "I really can't afford to fix this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll find a way." Ethan's expression softened. "Don't worry about it," he said. "Just call if you need anything." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but he was already turning toward the car. A driver emerged from the other side, looking irritated but saying nothing as Ethan gestured for him to wait. Before she could say another word, Ethan slipped into the passenger seat, and the car pulled away, leaving her standing on the curb with the card clutched in her hand. Sophia wheeled her bike to the sidewalk, her legs trembling from the adrenaline of the encounter. She leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch her breath. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The man, Ethan Grayson, was unlike anyone she had ever met. His calm demeanor, his unexpected kindness, it was disarming, almost unsettling. Most people would have been furious about the damage to their car, but he had barely reacted. Her gaze dropped to the card in her hand. It felt like a lifeline, though she wasn't sure to what. For a moment she considered tearing it up. What could she possibly have to do with someone like him? Their worlds couldn't be more different. But something stopped her. Curiosity, perhaps, or a faint hope that the encounter might mean more than just an accident. With a deep breath, she tucked the card into her pocket and climbed back onto her bike, wincing as her elbow throbbed. As she pedaled away, she couldn't shake the image of Ethan Grayson, his steady blue eyes, his measured voice. It was as if, in that brief moment, he had seen through her carefully constructed defenses, glimpsing the person she barely let herself be. By the time Sophia reached the cafe for her shift, the encounter felt like a distant memory. She threw herself into work, trying to ignore the gnawing thought at the back of her mind. Why had Ethan Grayson been so kind, and why did she feel as though her life had just been nudged in a direction she didn't fully understand? Unbeknownst to her, Ethan was sitting in the back seat of his car, the scratch on his Aston Martin long forgotten. He stared out the window, replaying the encounter in his mind. The girl Sophia had intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. There was something about her, a spark, a resilience that lingered long after she had disappeared into the crowd. And for the first time in years, Ethan found himself wondering about someone who wasn't part of his carefully curated world. Sophia woke the next morning to the sound of her mother coughing from the adjoining room. She pushed back the thin quilt covering her and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor was cold against her bare feet, grounding her in the reality of her life. She rubbed her eyes, still foggy from sleep, but her mind quickly filled with the memory of the previous day. Ethan Grayson, the scratch on his car. The business card now tucked safely into the pocket of her coat hanging by the door. The encounter felt like a strange dream, so far removed from her daily existence that she almost dismissed it as a fleeting coincidence. Almost. As she moved to the small kitchenette, Sophia glanced toward the thin curtain that separated the living area from her mother's bedroom. The sound of her mother's coughs was softer now, but it was a persistent reminder of why Sophia worked as hard as she did. She set the kettle on the stove to boil and opened the cabinet, grabbing a packet of instant oatmeal. The kitchen shelves were sparsely stocked, just a few cans of soup, some rice and a loaf of bread, but she made it work. She always made it work. Her mother emerged a few minutes later, leaning on the doorframe for support. Martha Hart was a thin woman in her early 50s, her once bright eyes dulled by years of chronic illness. Despite her frailty, she offered Sophia a warm smile. "Good morning, sweetheart," Martha said, her voice raspy but kind. "Morning, Mom," Sophia replied, pouring the hot water over the oats. She slid the bowl across the counter with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Martha lied, taking the bowl and sitting at the small kitchen table. "I think the new medication is helping." Sophia nodded, but said nothing. She knew the truth. The medication was barely keeping her mother's condition stable, and they couldn't afford the next refill. Her stomach twisted at the thought, but she pushed it aside. There was no room for despair. Not today. As Sophia prepared for her day, her coat caught her eye, the edges of Ethan's business card just visible in the pocket. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the fabric. Why had she kept it? She had no intention of calling him, no reason to involve herself further in a situation that already felt surreal. But something about him lingered in her mind. His calm demeanor, his refusal to accept her offer to pay for the car, and most of all, the way he had looked at her not with judgment, but with curiosity. It was unsettling, and yet intriguing. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Martha's voice broke through her thoughts. Sophia snapped out of her daze, shoving the card deeper into the pocket. "Yeah, Mom, just thinking about work." Martha smiled gently. "Don't work too hard. You need to take care of yourself too." Sophia nodded, forcing a smile. But as she left the apartment and stepped onto the busy street, her thoughts were anything but focused on herself. Across the city, Ethan Grayson stood in his penthouse, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. The morning light spilled across the sleek marble floors, casting long shadows on the minimalist furniture. The air smelled faintly of coffee, freshly brewed by his assistant, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere. Ethan had spent years perfecting the art of control over his company, his image, and every detail of his meticulously structured life. But yesterday had been different. The encounter with Sophia, a girl who had scratched his car and then insisted on paying for the damage she clearly couldn't afford, had stirred something in him. It wasn't pity, nor was it amusement. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. "Mr. Grayson?" His assistant Patrick interrupted his thoughts. "Your meeting with the board is in an hour." Ethan turned from the window, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'll be ready." Patrick hesitated, his usually unflappable demeanor faltering. "I couldn't help but notice the repair request for the Aston Martin. Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Ethan said quickly, his tone sharper than intended. He softened it with a slight smile. "I'll take care of it." Patrick nodded, though his expression betrayed mild confusion. Ethan rarely concerned himself with such minor matters. But as his assistant left the room, Ethan pulled out his phone, staring at the contact number he had saved the previous evening, Sophia Hart. He hadn't called yet, unsure of what he would even say. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't ready to let the encounter end there. By midday, Sophia was at the cafe, her apron tied tightly around her waist as she moved between tables. The lunch rush was in full swing, and the noise of clinking dishes and chattering customers filled the air. She balanced 2 trays on her arms, the weight of them a familiar strain. "Excuse me, miss." A sharp voice drew her attention to a woman seated near the window. The woman was impeccably dressed, her manicured hand waving impatiently. "I asked for oat milk in my coffee." "This isn't oat milk." Sophia bit back a sigh, forcing a polite smile. "I'm so sorry about that. I'll fix it right away." As she hurried back to the counter, the woman's muttered complaints followed her. Sophia's cheeks burned, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't afford to. The job, as exhausting as it was essential. When the rush finally died down, Sophia leaned against the counter, her arms aching. Her co-worker, Mia, nudged her with a grin. "Rough crowd today." "Always," Sophia replied with a small laugh. But her smile faded as her mind drifted back to the card in her pocket. She hadn't told anyone about the incident, not even Mia. It felt too strange, too personal. "Hey, you okay?" Mia asked, noticing her distraction. "Yeah," Sophia said quickly, "just tired." As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Sophia's shift finally ended. She untied her apron, her thoughts consumed by the errands she needed to run. But as she stepped outside, her heart skipped a beat. Parked at the curb, as incongruous as a diamond in a pile of coal, was the black Aston Martin. Ethan Grayson stood beside it, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His sharp suit and confident posture made him stand out against the bustling street. Sophia froze, her breath catching. He looked up, meeting her wide-eyed gaze with a faint smile. "Hello, Sophia," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Do you have a moment?" Her first instinct was to run, to retreat to the safety of her anonymity. But something about his expression stopped her, an earnestness she hadn't expected. Against her better judgment, she nodded. "I guess I do." And with that, the fragile line connecting their worlds grew a little stronger, pulling them both into a story neither could have anticipated. Sophia's heart pounded as she stepped closer to Ethan and his gleaming black Aston Martin. The late afternoon sunlight glinted off its polished surface, a stark contrast to the worn sidewalks and cluttered streets of her everyday life. The sight of Ethan standing there, calm, poised, and completely out of place, only added to her unease. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cautious but steady. Ethan's faint smile lingered as he gestured toward the coffee shop. "I thought I'd try the coffee you work so hard to serve." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by his casual tone. "You came all the way here for coffee?" "No," Ethan admitted, his smile fading. "I came to see you." Her breath hitched. The directness of his words unsettled her. She crossed her arms, trying to mask her nerves. "Why?" Ethan hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I was curious about you, Sophia. Yesterday it felt like we met by accident, but it didn't feel insignificant. I wanted to know more about you." Sophia stared at him, searching for a hint of insincerity in his expression, but his eyes, piercing and clear, held none of the condescension or pity she'd feared. Still, she couldn't shake her wariness. Men like Ethan Grayson didn't just show up at cafes for girls like her. "Curiosity isn't a reason to show up unannounced," she said, her tone sharper than intended. Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe not, but I thought it was worth the risk." The tension hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Sophia glanced toward the cafe, where Mia was watching through the window with wide eyes. A flush crept up Sophia's neck. She didn't need an audience for this strange encounter. "Fine," she said, sighing. "If you're so curious, let's talk. But not here." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Where would you prefer?" Sophia thought for a moment, then gestured toward a small park a few blocks away. "There's a place I like to go. It's quieter." They walked in silence, the city's noise fading as they entered the park. The late autumn leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was crisp with the scent of earth and impending winter. Sophia led Ethan to a weathered bench near a small pond, its surface reflecting the orange hues of the setting sun. "This is it," she said, sitting down. "My escape." Ethan sat beside her, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intent. "It suits you," he said after a moment. "Peaceful, thoughtful, like you." Sophia frowned, unsure how to respond. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Not yet," Ethan agreed, "but I'd like to." Sophia shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "I don't understand what you want from me," she admitted. Someone like you doesn't just show up in someone's life without a reason." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, as if her words had struck a nerve. "Someone like me?" he echoed. "What does that mean?" "You're rich," she said bluntly. "You drive a car that costs more than I'll probably earn in a lifetime, and I work in a cafe to pay rent and keep my mom's meds stocked. We're from completely different worlds, Ethan." "I know that," he said softly, "but I don't see why it has to matter." "It matters because it's reality," Sophia replied, her voice rising. "You can walk away from this conversation and go back to your perfect life, but I can't. My world doesn't work that way." Ethan was silent for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. "You're right. I can't pretend to understand what you go through, but that doesn't mean I don't want to try." Sophia's heart twisted at the sincerity in his tone, but she forced herself to stay guarded. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you care?" Ethan hesitated, then met her eyes. "Because you're different. You're not impressed by the car or the suit or the name. You see through it, and I haven't felt this real in a long time." Before Sophia could respond, the sound of an approaching car drew their attention. A sleek black SUV pulled up at the edge of the park, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. The driver stepped out, a tall man in a crisp black suit. "Mr. Grayson," the man called, his tone clipped. "You're needed back at the office. There's an issue with the Ashbourne deal." Ethan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Of course there is," he muttered under his breath. He stood, his gaze flickering back to Sophia. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut this short." Sophia shook her head, standing as well. "It's fine. You have more important things to do." "That's not what I meant." Ethan said quickly. He hesitated, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket, scribbling something on a page before tearing it out. "This is my number. If you ever want to talk, or if you need anything, call me." Sophia stared at the paper in his outstretched hand, her instincts screaming at her to refuse. But something deeper, quieter, told her to take it. Reluctantly, she slipped the paper into her jacket pocket. "Take care, Sophia," Ethan said, his voice soft. And then he was gone, the SUV disappearing down the street and leaving her standing alone. Sophia returned home that evening feeling unmoored. The encounter with Ethan had left her more confused than ever. His words replayed in her mind, mixing with the doubts that clung to her like a shadow. She pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket, staring at the neatly written number. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. Sophia looked up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Just a long day." Martha nodded, her face lined with worry but trusting her daughter's reassurance. As she returned to her room, Sophia sat on the edge of her bed, the number still in her hand. Against her better judgment, she saved it in her phone. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in the back seat of the SUV, his thoughts far from the Ashbourne deal. Sophia's words echoed in his mind, a harsh but necessary reminder of the divide between their lives. For the first time in years, he felt unsure of how to bridge that divide, unsure of what it meant that he wanted to. But one thing was certain, Sophia Hart wasn't someone he could forget, and he didn't want to. The days following Ethan's unexpected appearance at the cafe were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions for Sophia. Her life continued, as it always had, early mornings at the apartment, juggling shifts at the cafe, and late nights sketching by the dim glow of her desk lamp. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the memory of his words or the strange warmth in his eyes when he'd spoken to her. The scrap of paper with his number sat tucked in the back pocket of her notebook, a silent question she wasn't ready to answer. Every time she caught sight of it, a knot of anxiety and curiosity tightened in her chest. What would calling him even accomplish? They came from two entirely different worlds, and she had no place in his. Still, the thought lingered. On the other side of the city, Ethan sat in his sprawling penthouse, surrounded by luxury that felt increasingly empty. The view from his floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking, a glittering panorama of Manhattan's skyline. But tonight, the sight held little comfort. He had just ended a tense video conference about the Ashbourne deal, a multi-million-dollar project that seemed to occupy every corner of his team's attention. Ethan should have been focused, absorbed in the intricacies of contracts and market strategies. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Sophia, the girl with the quiet strength in her voice and the wary look in her eyes. Patrick, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Grayson, the final draft of the Ashbourne agreement is ready for your review." Ethan barely glanced at him. "Leave it on my desk. I'll look at it later." Patrick hesitated, then added carefully, "You seem distracted lately. Is everything all right?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm fine, Patrick, just tired." But he wasn't fine. For the first time in years, something or someone had broken through the carefully constructed walls of his life, and he didn't know what to do about it. Sophia's routine shifted subtly over the next week. She began taking longer routes home, avoiding places where she thought she might run into Ethan. The idea of seeing him again filled her with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. But fate had other plans. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when Sophia stopped by a small art supply store in Chelsea, her favorite spot for discounted brushes and paints. She was scanning the shelves when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she froze. Ethan stood a few feet away, dressed in a black wool coat and leather gloves. He looked as out of place as a diamond in a thrift store, yet there was something oddly unassuming about the way he carried himself. His expression brightened when he saw her, as if her presence had dispelled a cloud hanging over him. "Sophia," he said, his voice warm and surprised. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Sophia clutched the paint tube in her hand like a lifeline. I could say the same about you. Ethan glanced around, a faint smile tugging at his lips. I needed a gift. A friend of mine has a gallery opening soon, and I thought something from here might be more meaningful than sending flowers. She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. A billionaire shopping for art supplies. Is it that unbelievable? Ethan asked, tilting his head. I have layers, you know. Sophia couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. It was the first genuine smile she'd given him, and Ethan felt a flicker of satisfaction. They ended up leaving the store together, the chilly air biting at their cheeks as they walked toward the nearest subway station. Sophia still carried her usual wariness, but something about Ethan's quiet persistence made it harder to keep her walls up. Do you always wander into random shops looking for people to impress? She asked, half teasing. Ethan chuckled, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. Only when I'm curious about someone. Sophia glanced at him, her defenses wavering. You don't even know me. Then let me, he said simply. His words hung in the air, vulnerable and direct. Sophia looked away, her throat tightening. Ethan, I don't think this, whatever this is, can work. Why not? Because we don't belong in the same world, she said, her voice rising slightly. You live in a penthouse and drive a car that costs more than I'll ever see in my life. I'm just trying to make it through the week without falling apart. Ethan stopped walking, his expression serious. Sophia, I know we come from different places. I know it won't be easy, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. She turned to face him, her frustration bubbling over. What do you want from me, Ethan? Why me? He hesitated, the vulnerability in his eyes catching her off guard. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like the CEO of Grayson Enterprises. I feel like just a man. And I haven't felt that way in a long time. Sophia's breath caught. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice was disarming, and for the first time she glimpsed the loneliness behind his polished exterior. When they reached the subway station, Ethan stopped at the entrance, his hands still in his pockets. I'll let you go, he said, his voice quieter now, but I hope you'll think about what I said. Sophia nodded, her emotions a swirling mix of confusion, fear, and something she couldn't quite name. She watched as he turned and walked away, his tall figure disappearing into the bustling crowd. That night, as she sat at her small desk, sketching by the dim light of her lamp, Sophia replayed their conversation over and over. She wanted to dismiss him, to write him off as just another rich man playing games. But the way he'd looked at her, the honesty in his voice, it felt real. Her pencil stilled on the page, the outlines of a cityscape incomplete. She reached for her notebook, pulling out the scrap of paper with his number. Staring at it, she felt the weight of a decision pressing down on her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that someone might see her not as a burden, not as a problem to solve, but as someone worth knowing. With a deep breath, Sophia reached for her phone. The soft glow of a single desk lamp lit Sophia's small room as she stared at her phone, the scrap of paper with Ethan's number lying beside it. Her fingers hovered over the keypad, her heart pounding as if the simple act of dialing could upend her world. The air in the apartment was still, broken only by the occasional sound of her mother's coughing from the other room. She'd spent days replaying their encounters, his words echoing in her mind. When I'm with you, I don't feel like the CEO of Grayson Enterprises. I feel like just a man. The sincerity in his voice had left a crack in the walls she had spent years building around her heart. But was it real? Could she trust him or herself to let someone like him into her life? With a shaky breath, Sophia pressed the green call button before she could overthink it. The phone rang once, twice, and then a third time. Just as she was about to hang up, his voice came through, smooth and steady. Sophia, Ethan said, a note of surprise in his tone. I wasn't sure I'd hear from you. I wasn't sure I'd call, she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. I'm glad you did, he said, and she could almost hear the smile in his voice. How are you? Sophia hesitated, unsure how to answer such a simple question. "I'm fine," she said eventually. "I guess I don't know why I called." "Maybe you wanted to see if I'd answer," Ethan suggested gently. "Or maybe you're curious about me too." She couldn't help but smile faintly, though her nerves remained. Maybe. There was a pause, the silence between them filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Ethan broke it. "Would you let me take you to dinner? No pressure, just a chance for us to talk." Sophia's first instinct was to say no, to retreat back into her familiar world of solitude and self-preservation. But something about Ethan's calm persistence made her hesitate. Against her better judgment, she found herself saying, "Okay, just dinner." 2 nights later, Ethan arrived at Sophia's apartment building in a black sedan, his driver waiting discreetly at the curb. He had insisted on picking her up, though she'd tried to argue against it. Now, as she stepped out of the building in her simple navy dress and borrowed heels, she felt the full weight of the divide between their worlds. Ethan stepped out of the car to greet her, his tailored suit impeccable yet understated. When his eyes met hers, they softened, his smile genuine. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low. Sophia flushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thanks. You clean up pretty well yourself." He chuckled, opening the car door for her. The gesture was simple but so unfamiliar to Sophia that it left her momentarily disarmed. The restaurant Ethan had chosen was an intimate Italian place, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was far from the flashy venues she'd expected, its warm lighting and rustic decor creating an atmosphere that felt surprisingly welcoming. Sophia relaxed slightly as they were seated, though her nerves still buzzed beneath the surface. Over plates of freshly made pasta and glasses of wine, their conversation began to flow. Ethan asked about her art, his questions thoughtful and sincere. Sophia found herself opening up, talking about her love for painting and how it had been a refuge during her most difficult times. "What about you?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "What made you want to build a real estate empire?" Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression contemplative. "It wasn't about the money," he said after a moment. "Not at first. My father started the company, but he was cold, distant. I thought if I could make it bigger, more successful, maybe he'd finally see me." Sophia's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his voice. "Did it work?" Ethan shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. "He passed away before I had the chance. And by then, I realized I didn't need his approval. But the work, it became my identity. It was easier than figuring out who I was outside of it." The raw honesty in his words left Sophia momentarily speechless. She hadn't expected this level of depth from him, but it made her see him in a new light, not as the untouchable CEO, but as a man carrying his own scars. As the evening drew to a close, the atmosphere between them had shifted. Sophia felt a connection growing, fragile but undeniable. But just as she began to let her guard down, the illusion was shattered. As they waited for the car outside the restaurant, a photographer appeared from seemingly nowhere, his camera flashing. "Ethan Grayson, who's your date?" the man called out, his voice loud and intrusive. Sophia froze, her heart pounding as the photographer snapped several more pictures. Ethan stepped in front of her, shielding her from view. "That's enough," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The photographer muttered something under his breath before disappearing into the night. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched her bag, the reality of Ethan's world crashing down on her. "I'm so sorry," Ethan said, his voice gentle but filled with regret. "I didn't expect that to happen." Sophia forced a shaky smile, though her mind was spinning. "It's not your fault." But as they rode back to her apartment in silence, the weight of the evening pressed down on her. No matter how genuine Ethan seemed, his world was one of scrutiny and exposure, one she wasn't sure she could navigate. When they reached her building, Ethan walked her to the door. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I hope tonight didn't scare you off," he said finally. his tone soft. Sophia looked up at him, her emotions a tangled knot. "I don't know, Ethan. Everything about this feels impossible." "It doesn't have to be," he said, stepping closer. "I know it's not easy, and I know I've brought complications into your life, but I meant what I said. I want to know you, Sophia. I want this to work." Her throat tightened as she met his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes was almost too much to bear. I don't know if I can handle it," she whispered. "Then let me handle it with you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Just don't shut me out." Sophia nodded faintly, though her doubts remained. As she watched him walk away, she felt the pull of two worlds colliding: the safe, predictable life she knew, and the chaotic, exhilarating unknown he represented. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure which one she truly belonged to. The days after their dinner were a blur for Sophia, filled with the same routines she had always known: long hours at the cafe, hurried trips to the art store, and nights spent sketching by the faint glow of her desk lamp. Yet something had shifted. Ethan's presence lingered like a faint echo, an undercurrent in her thoughts that she couldn't quite suppress. She hadn't called him. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to. The chaos of the photographer's intrusion outside the restaurant had been a stark reminder of the divide between them, a gap that felt impossible to bridge. Yet the memory of Ethan's steady gaze and heartfelt words tugged at her, refusing to be silenced. Ethan, meanwhile, found himself consumed by thoughts of Sophia. He spent hours staring at his phone, her name saved in his contacts like a fragile lifeline. Work meetings, boardroom debates, and strategic decisions, all the things that once defined his life, now felt hollow in comparison to the quiet moments he had shared with her. One evening, as the city's lights glittered outside his penthouse, he made a decision. Picking up his phone, he typed a message, hesitated for a moment, then hit send. "I know things feel complicated, but I'd like to see you again. No pressure. Just let me know." Sophia read the text late that night, her fingers trembling as she held the phone. She stared at the words, her heart a storm of conflicting emotions. The simple, earnest tone of his message disarmed her, making it harder to cling to the walls she had so carefully built. A week later, as Sophia was finishing her shift at the cafe, a delivery man walked in holding a small package. "Sophia Hart?" he asked, scanning the room. "That's me," she said, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped forward. The man handed her the package with a polite smile. "Enjoy." Confused, Sophia opened the box to find a carefully wrapped set of high-quality watercolor paints, the kind she had only ever dreamed of affording. Tucked inside was a note in Ethan's neat handwriting: "For the artist who deserves the best tools." E. Her co-workers crowded around, oohing and ahhing over the gift. "Who's E?" Mia teased, nudging her. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Sophia flushed, quickly tucking the note back into the box. "It's nothing," she said, though her heart told her otherwise. That night, as she sat at her desk, she opened the paints and began to work. Her brush moved across the paper with newfound ease, the vibrant colors breathing life into her sketch. For the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of joy she hadn't realized she was missing. Across town, Ethan was facing his own set of challenges. The fallout from the tabloid photo had been swift, with whispers circulating through the corporate world about his mystery date. His sister Elena, ever protective of the Grayson name, confronted him during a meeting in his office. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she demanded, her tone sharp. "You know how these things look. The board is already asking questions." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "I don't care what they think, Elena. My personal life isn't their business." Elena sighed, exasperated. "This isn't just about you, it's about the company, our reputation. You can't let your emotions cloud your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Ethan replied evenly. "And if you think I'm going to let a few rumors dictate my life, you don't know me as well as you think." Elena shook her head, frustration evident. "Just be careful, Ethan. People like her don't understand what it means to be part of our world." Ethan's jaw tightened at her words, but he said nothing. The conversation left a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder of the challenges Sophia would face if she chose to let him in. It was late afternoon when Sophia finally decided to text Ethan. Her message was short and to the point. "Thank you for the paints. They're beautiful." His reply came almost instantly. "You're welcome. Can I see what you've made with them?" Sophia hesitated, then snapped a quick photo of her latest painting, a vibrant cityscape that captured the energy and chaos of New York. She sent it before she could second-guess herself. "It's stunning," Ethan replied. "You have an incredible gift." Sophia smiled despite herself, her doubts momentarily quieted. After a moment's hesitation, she typed another message. "Are you free tomorrow?" They met the next day at the park where they had first sat together. The air was crisp, the leaves crunching beneath their feet as they walked toward the bench by the pond. Sophia clutched a thermos of tea, her fingers brushing against the cool metal as she tried to calm her nerves. Ethan was already there, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He smiled when he saw her, his expression warm and genuine. Hi, Sophia replied, sitting beside him. For a while they talked about safe topics, her art, his latest project, the changing seasons. But the unspoken tension between them lingered, a weight that neither could ignore. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "Ethan, I'm scared." He turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Of what?" "Of this," she said, gesturing between them. "Of what it means. Of what it could cost." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Sophia, I can't promise it'll be easy, but I can promise that I'll be here, no matter what." Her throat tightened at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her doubts. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." "You are," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You're stronger than you think, and you don't have to do it alone." Sophia looked at him, her defenses crumbling. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in shades of gold and orange, they sat together in silence. The world around them faded, leaving only the quiet certainty of their connection. For Ethan, it was a moment of clarity, a realization that he would fight for this, no matter the challenges. For Sophia, it was a fragile step toward trust, a willingness to embrace the unknown. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, they were willing to face it together. The days following their quiet meeting in the park were filled with an unspoken shift between Sophia and Ethan. Their connection, once tentative and fragile, now felt like a thread pulling them closer, though the weight of their separate worlds loomed ever larger. Both knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time they shared the resolve to face it together. Sophia sat at her small desk, staring at a half-finished painting. The vibrant colors on the canvas seemed to mock her turmoil, their brightness a stark contrast to the storm inside her. She'd always been good at compartmentalizing, at shutting out the noise of her life to focus on survival. But Ethan had changed that. He made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced in years, yet that same feeling terrified her. Letting him into her life meant exposing the cracks she had spent so long hiding, not just from others, but from herself. A soft knock on her door broke her thoughts. Her mother peeked inside, her face pale but smiling. "Sweetheart, you've been quiet all evening. Everything okay?" Sophia forced a smile, closing her sketchbook. "Yeah, Mom, just working on something." Martha stepped inside, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You've been different lately. Happier, I think. Is there someone special?" Sophia's cheeks flushed. "Mom, it's not like that." Martha chuckled softly, her frail hand reaching out to cover Sophia's. "It's okay to let someone in, you know. You've been carrying so much on your own. You deserve to share it with someone who cares." Her mother's words lingered long after she left the room. Meanwhile, Ethan's resolve was tested within his own world. The whispers from the boardroom had grown louder, and Eleanor had made it clear she disapproved of his relationship with Sophia. During a late-night conversation in his office, she voiced her concerns bluntly. Ethan, you're risking everything for this. The company, your reputation, our reputation. Do you really think she's ready for what this life demands? Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. This isn't about the company, Elena. It's about me. For once, I'm choosing something because it matters to me, not to anyone else. And what about her? Elena pressed. Do you think she'll survive the scrutiny, the pressure? People will tear her apart just to get to you. Ethan stood, his voice firm. Then I'll protect her. I won't let anyone hurt her. Elena shook her head, her frustration evident. You're too idealistic, Ethan. This isn't a fairy tale. No, Ethan said quietly. But maybe it's worth fighting for anyway. A week later, the tension came to a head. Sophia and Ethan met at a small, quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, a place far from prying eyes. Ethan noticed the strain in Sophia's expression as soon as she arrived. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Sophia hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I've been thinking, maybe this isn't a good idea." Ethan's heart sank, but he leaned forward, his voice calm. "Why?" "Because you're Ethan Grayson," she said, her voice trembling. "You have this whole life, this world that I don't belong in, and no matter how much we try to ignore it, it's always going to be there." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "Sophia, I don't care about any of that. I care about you." "But it's not that simple," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "Your sister, the media, the people who look at me like I don't belong, they'll never stop. And I don't know if I'm strong enough to handle it." Ethan's grip tightened on her hand. "You are strong enough. I've seen it in everything you do, every choice you've made, and you don't have to face this alone. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Sophia looked at him, her heart breaking under the weight of her doubts. "But what if I can't be enough for you? What if I ruin everything you've built?" "You won't," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You've already made my life better just by being in it. Please, don't walk away." For a moment they sat in silence, the gravity of their situation pressing down on them. Finally, Sophia exhaled shakily, nodding. "Okay, I'll try." Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. "That's all I need." As they worked to navigate their relationship, the challenges only grew. The media frenzy around their connection intensified, with tabloids printing invasive stories about Sophia's past. One headline read, "Cinderella or Gold Digger? Meet the woman stealing Ethan Grayson's heart." Sophia was devastated, her worst fears realized. She avoided Ethan for days, retreating into her art and the safety of her apartment. But Ethan refused to let her shut him out. He showed up at her door late one night, his expression resolute. "I'm not letting them scare you away," he said. "I don't care what they write or say. None of it matters. You matter." Sophia's tears spilled over as she let him in. "I don't know how to do this, Ethan." "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, pulling her into his arms. One step at a time. Months later, Sophia stood in a bustling gallery surrounded by her paintings. The walls were filled with her work, vivid cityscapes, intimate portraits, and abstract pieces that captured the depth of her emotions. The show was a success, with collectors and critics alike praising her talent. Ethan stood by her side, his pride evident as he introduced her to attendees. Eleanor, who had initially opposed their relationship, was among them, offering a hesitant but genuine smile of support. As the evening drew to a close, Sophia stepped outside for a moment of quiet. Ethan joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "Look at what you've done," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "I couldn't have done it without you," Sophia replied, leaning into him. "Yes, you could," Ethan said softly. "But I'm glad you let me be part of it." They stood together under the city lights, their connection stronger than ever. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had chosen each other, and that was enough. Life doesn't always follow the paths we expect, but sometimes the unexpected can lead us to exactly where we're meant to be. Sophia and Ethan's journey wasn't just about love, it was about finding strength in vulnerability, overcoming challenges together, and proving that true connection can bridge even the widest gaps. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this one to life. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.